In a world where technology is rewriting the rules at lightning speed, disruption is not coming, it's already here. The question is, are you ready? Welcome to Tech Week, your insider's guide to the digital revolution transforming business, policy, and innovation in the Philippines and beyond. I'm your host, Jack Madrid, and we are cutting through the noise to bring you the real stories shaping our future. We're talking to the risk takers, the game changers, and the architects of tomorrow, unfiltered and straight from the source. This is not just tech news. This is the roadmap to what's next. This is Tech Week, and this is how we decode the future. In today's hyper-connected world, data moves faster than borders. But more and more governments are saying, not so fast. Across Asia-Pacific, new data localization laws are being introduced. These laws require personal and business data to be stored and processed within national borders. And that's a game changer. For companies, this is not just a legal issue. It is a fundamental shift. It affects cloud services, cross-border trade, and cybersecurity. It even affects how people access information. And at the center of it all is a powerful question. Who really controls your data? Is it the country you live in? Is it the company that stores it? Or is it the cloud that connects it? To help us unpack this complex and urgent topic, we are joined today by someone with deep expertise in law, policy, and data privacy. Attorney Mike Montero is the Asia-Pacific Regional General Counsel and Head of Government Affairs for Concentrix. He is also the Head of Government Affairs, Corporate Secretary, and Data Protection Officer. Let's welcome Mike Montero to the show. Welcome, Mike.
Hi, Jack. Thanks for having me.
So let us get right to it, Mike. Let us start with the basics. What exactly is this thing called data sovereignty, and how is it different from concepts like data privacy or cybersecurity?
Yeah, so these are words that are often interchanged with each other, but they do have distinct meanings and I guess maybe importance as well. So data sovereignty really is just trying to identify the rules, the set of rules that would apply in terms of data when it is initially collected and ultimately stored. So when you talk about data sovereignty, the rule really is that the government that has jurisdiction over where the collection and the storage happen would have control over the rules that are implemented regardless of where they are subsequently processed and or accessed. So if you distinguish that, for instance, with data privacy, and I'm not going to go very far in the Philippine setting, data privacy is governed by the Data Privacy Act. And when we talk about data privacy, it's really just attempting to ensure that there's afforded protection to personal data, for the most part, of what are known as data subjects, but in reality, we're really talking about natural persons or individuals. So you start with identification of what type of information it is that you're trying to protect, and you go down the road of really putting in place safeguards to ensure that these protections are actually implemented. And then obviously, lastly would be cybersecurity. Cybersecurity, I would think, is probably the broadest among all these three concepts. So when you touch upon cybersecurity, you're looking at a set of systems, tools, or even networks that would allow for the protection against intrusion and unauthorized access of these personal data. So you're really wanting to place all these, even practices for that matter, so that, again, you're able to defend against these intrusions, which, as you know, could even go as far as exfiltrations.
So thanks for that, Attorney Mike. Let's go to to a topic that's been making the rounds recently, Attorney Mike. There was a last-minute data localization clause that was added to the Open Access and Konektadong Pinoy Bill. Now, from a legal and regulatory perspective, what are the implications of this, and what is it about? Does it impact the requirement of certain data to be stored only within Philippine borders?
So I think what we need to really try to understand is what the coverage is with respect to, as you mentioned, Jack, this provision, which is rather short. And in fact, the fact that it was abbreviated rather than one that is more elaborate, as you would expect from any legal provision, is the one that probably provides a little bit more worry than comfort with respect to those that could be impacted by this, right? So I will address your question in terms of what it or how it impacts us from a legal and a regulatory standpoint. I think that all is dependent on how the interpretation is at the end of the day. And when I say that, what I really mean is that if you look at the provision, it really speaks very broadly of two terms that are very critical. One is it talks about local data. So as I just mentioned a while ago, there's a really critical path towards ensuring that the classification of data is crystal clear.
Yes.
Otherwise, that creates so many opportunities for misinterpretation, right? And therefore, the use of local data begs the question of, are you talking about sensitive data only? Are you talking about confidential data? Or are you even speaking about top secret type of data? And even on the other side of the spectrum, the question that also needs to be answered is that, is this just personal data? Or does it go into business data, for instance?
Or government.
Correct, exactly. So these are questions that cannot be answered by that. And hence, from a regulatory and a legal perspective, the ability of those that could be covered by is diminished by the fact that there's no certainty on whether you are or you are not covered. The other side of it is that even if we did set that aside, one other aspect of that provision is that it talks about the two drivers that could in fact influence what the regulatory framework has to be. And those drivers are national security and public interest. National security is something that we could readily understand, right? So when you, as I mentioned a while ago, I used the term top secret. So if you're talking about really top secret information that's really sensitive for government to be able to protect and defend itself, then you can very well say that that falls into the bucket of national security. But when you talk about public interest, then it's again, there's a huge disparity between what could be public interest and what could be treated as not public interest. And depending on who's speaking about it, it could really vary quite extremely, right? So therefore, I guess maybe the issue with respect to that provision is the clarity. And in any situation where you're talking about the ability of entities that will be covered by all these provisions in terms of legal and regulatory compliance is, do we understand it? And does the implementing agency understand it as well? So I think that's the issue that we face with, at least with respect to the specific provision that we're alluding to.
So with this rather ambiguous type wording, these implementing agencies, what are the risks, Attorney Mike, of these agencies having their own interpretation and using it in a way that may not align, with the intent?
So without the benefit of having a protracted, I guess, deliberation and consultation with all the stakeholders, the pitfall is that the agencies could just implement what is known as the rules-based approach. And the rules-based approach is one that does not take into account the possible risks that are attendant into any implementation of any rules. What that simply means, Jack, is that we believe that in theory these rules will be sound, will be reasonable, will be practical, and that it will be beneficial and it will cut across all industries or even all individuals that will be impacted by it. without any due regard to the actual risk that could be there. So that's really the limitation that you have in terms of having such an ambiguous type of provision. The other angle that we need to account for is that in the Philippines, as you know, the process is that laws are passed by Congress and the implementation is done by the administrative agency. Yeah. It's not always necessarily so that the spirit and the actual intent of the law is what is ultimately implemented. It is not to say that there's bad faith in the implementation. It is just that there may be a disconnect or some could be lost in translation from the passing of the baton from the Congress to the administrative agency, and hence the inclination always of any stakeholder is that the deliberations in the Congress is what is preferred as opposed to an administrative agency just simply implementing it. Because as you know, the lawmaking process is more, while more protracted, you know that it's more deliberate because they have hearings, they have sessions, they solicit all the inputs from all the stakeholders, right? They do that as well in implementing and executive agencies, but they are bound by the time that's provided for by the law itself. In certain instances, you only have 90 days to come up with the implementing rules. Not enough, if you ask me, to be able to really, carry out the task of being able to solicit all the inputs from all the necessary stakeholders.
You know, we're going to talk about the impact of this, Attorney Mike, on the IT-BPM industry. Sure. But right now, we're going to take a short break. Trade Talks Tech Week. We'll be right back. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Tech Week. We continue our conversation with Attorney Mike Montero of Concentrix. Mike, let's talk about the IT-BPM industry, which relies very heavily on cross-border data flows to serve our global clients. Now, how would any form of mandatory data localization affect the country's competitiveness as a service delivery destination for multinational companies?
Yeah. So I like that you use the phrase any form, Jack, right? Because again, that's where the ambiguity again kicks in, right? Because if you think about it, localization can come in so many forms and means. So you could have a restriction that applies on where the storage has to happen. You could have a restriction that applies on how cross-border data flows will occur. So you could have the most liberal one, which is that there's no local storage requirement and that all cross-border data flows will be permitted. Or you could have the most restricted version where there is a localization and that no cross-border data flow actually is allowed, right? So again, given the ambiguity, we don't know where everything will reside at the end. The IT-BPM industry obviously can suffer significantly if it's the worst kind of localization that will come into play. If you think about it from the from two perspectives, right? One is that as a company, we process two significant buckets of data. One is the data that we hold for our employees, and the other is the data that we hold for our clients, and as a representation, the data that we hold for their customers. Correct. If it's the latter that's actually restricted, then that's a real game changer, right? Because then that will necessitate that we rework our contracts, maybe even alter our business models to the extent that we're not even sure whether there's going to be a continuity of the business as we know it.
So you're saying our global clients could say, hey, we're not going to do business in the Philippines.
Exactly. Well, that's a possibility. Again, that's precisely because we're not certain where this will all lead up to. But that notwithstanding, Jack, even if we set that aside and we say that that's probably not going to happen, and we look at just that localization just from the perspective of our employees' data, that's still significantly going to impact us. because that will impact us in terms of our competitiveness. But the direct impact of it is really the incremental cost that it will present to us, because as we do the localization, we then need to change the way that we actually do our business from an operation standpoint. I'll give you an example, right? So the way that it currently stands, companies that have 50,000 headcount, 100,000 headcount, what they do is that they rely on hyperscalers to be storing their data. And as we engage with these hyperscalers, we obviously have volume discounts as we do that. And there's really no regard to where all these data are being stored. If there's an alteration of that model and we're forced to locate all the data here, we don't know how much price point we're going to have to contend with. And as you are very well aware, this is a cutthroat competition.
Yes.
And if we compare ourselves to our competitor, any price point differential that's even very minuscule is going to be very significant. So in my mind, regardless of where the localization ultimately resides, there will be an impact. The only question is how much impact it will be. If I may be permitted to say, in the study that was rendered by the OECD, they had seen that it could be anywhere from 16% to 55% of incremental cost, depending on which type of localization you're looking at. So as you even if it's at 16%, it's still a significant impact to us. At 55%, I don't know where we're going to end up with that kind of an impact, Jack.
Well, thank you for explaining the cost implications, Mike. Now, let's flip the argument. Supporters of localization often cite national security, data protection, as the reasons. Do you think that existing frameworks like DICT's cloud-first policy already adequately address those concerns?
I'll answer that in the affirmative, Jack, right? So that there have been two issuances by the DICT upholding the cloud-first policy, 2017, the first one, and I think there was an iteration in 2020. I think there's no question that if you really just look at the national security issues that need to be addressed and related to localization, that there's really adequate safeguards and adequate issuances and legal basis to be able to address that, right? But even if you go outside of that and think about, if you look at all the materials with respect to localization, one thing that's always attached to it, and we began this segment by talking about that, is really security, cybersecurity, right? So the question becomes, with localization, are you really increasing your ability to actually protect the data and prevent any intrusion in the form of cybersecurity? The answer has been, and again, I go back to the hyperscalers. They've been doing this for the longest time. They put in place all the safeguards. They know what to do, right? The redundancies are all in place, right? They have democratized the way to do data storage, and they understand what it is. When we migrate all our data here, the question becomes, do we have that capability, right? The question that's also related to that is this really the right approach, right? Don't we have the Data Privacy Act to do the protection, right? And even if we do that, isn't there anything else that we can do? My submission is that why don't we look at amending the Cybercrime Prevention Act? We've been pushing for that for the longest time. And we've said that this is an important tool that will allow us to protect our data in the ways that we have not been able to do so. I think if we're able to take that step, a rather simple, short step that does not entail any sacrifice that needs to be made, because obviously the only group or sector that you're compromising are the bad actors, and you're really not out there to protect them. We'll take that step, we're able to protect our data. I think more significantly and more directly than jumping into something that's an unknown.
Certainly, a lot more discussion seems to be warranted there. And Attorney Mike, you've been part of this. IBPAP, has called for more, deeper, more inclusive discussions on data localization. Now, in your view, how better can we make this consultative process that I think, should happen, before any kind of policy of this scale is implemented?
Yeah, so I'll go back to what I said. Is really, if you bifurcated the entire rule-making process, you have legislative and the administrative or the implementation side, right? we've always advocated that if we need to change this, let's go through the lawmaking process. It's more deliberative, it's more consultative, right? And I guess when asked the question of who needs to be there, I think everybody needs to speak their minds out, right? At one point, I think when initially this localization was being pushed, the two sectors that were significantly involved were the financial sector and the healthcare sector. I'm not sure whether they've been asked the question as well of how this will impact them, right? There was a study before on the benefits of the cloud-enabled healthcare in Asia Pacific. The numbers that came out were so astounding. $21 billion in savings that could translate in so many benefits, right? If you negate that by mandating localization, we don't know where this will all end up, right? Even those that will benefit from localization, for instance, the data centers, have been incentivized by Create More. They were given all these tax incentives. It just goes to show that when you go through the legislative process, all the stakeholders are taken into account, all are heard, and at the end of the day, it's a much better product rather than having something that's very brief, that's very broad, could be ambiguous,
yeah, right.
and right. you have a very short window within which time to put together implementing rules.
That's very clear, Attorney Mike. So, I think we have a lot of business leaders watching us in this show, Mike. What would you say? So, especially for those managing shared services or BPO companies, what would be your advice on how they can prepare for possible changes in data regulation while staying compliant with both Philippine law and global client requirements?
Yeah. I think even before that, Jack, I think I've always been an advocate of, if there's something that you feel is going to be bothersome or is going to be a problem with respect to the way that you run business, right? You make sure that you're able to back it up, right? And we've been together in all of these advocacies, and even when the tax rules were being changed in the middle of the game, the thought has always been, study what the possible impacts could be, and make sure that you back it up with actual empirical data, right? So I think my advice would be understand what localization truly is, right? From as I mentioned a while ago, the strictest type of implementation of the same and to the most liberal one. Simulate what the impact could be to your business. And if you feel that it's truly significant, come forward. Make sure that you make known what the issues could be and how it will translate into the potential investments that you will be making, the employment that you've been contributing to the economy, just to make sure that this is heard. So that if at the end of the day, despite all these submissions, right, there's a clear understanding that we did not take a leap of faith blindly, that we truly understood what it is that we were getting into. So that's really my suggestion to them. If it does become law and regulation, right? So I think the only way to really go about it is to truly understand, what your options are, but always staying compliant with the provisions of either the law or the implementing regulation.
Very sound and very clear articulation of what we need to do. I'm sure this will not be the last conversation, Attorney Mike, that we will have. But that will be a wrap for this week's Tech Week. A huge thank you to Attorney Mike Montero for sharing your valuable insights with us this afternoon.
Thanks, Jack.
The future is being built right now, and conversations like these help us decode the future and navigate what comes next. Join us again next week as we dive into another game-changing story shaping technology, business, and innovation. Until then, stay curious, stay bold, and stay ahead. I am Jack Madrid, and you can watch BNC on Free TV Channel 31 and on Signal Channel 24. Thank you for watching BNC, the Billionario News Channel, always on top.